Greetings, y'all. Welcome back to the Watering Hole. I'm glad you could come today. We had to bump it up an hour, and I shared it out. So if y'all could begin sharing it out to your groups, and they'll only let you do 10 groups at a time, I believe, and also to your profile pages, your newsfeed, and invite through Messenger. And I know that they've slowed that down, but we just roll with how we roll. And then tag people, and you can do it in groups of like 6, 7, 8, and then take a pause before you tag again, so that they don't cause you not to be able to comment during this. It's going to be a little bit different formatted today. I'm going to do the devotion after a few more people get in and introduce Gary, and then I am going to have him take it away. And there's an hour and a half he has time frame, so he's going to get a lot accomplished in an hour and a half. And unless Holy Spirit has me interrupt, I will not be interrupting. So I appreciate you guys, and keep on sharing this out. Good morning, Tara, Bob Thompson, Yvonne, Delphina, Lillian. Blessings to every one of you. And yeah, just keep sharing it out. I know that it's a little bit short notice, but we'll get them in here, right? Find freedom through seeking to please me above all else. You can have only one master. When you let others' expectations drive you, you scatter your energy to the winds. Your own desire to look good can also drain your energy. I am your master, and I do not drive you to be what you are not. Your pretense displeases me, especially when it is in my service. Concentrate on staying close to me at all times. It is impossible to be inauthentic while you are focusing on my presence. And that's referenced in Ephesians 5, 8 through 10, Matthew 23, 8, and Matthew 6, 1. And so I am going to, Gary Kaw is he worked for the government and was seeing things within the government, and it veered him toward and gave him an unction to go into teaching on globalization and Bible prophecy. And he has quite a testimony of how all of this transpired. And I'm just laying that little bit of groundwork. He is also an author of En Route to Global Occupation, as well as, I have it written here. One World Religion. One World Religion. I start getting those a little dyslexic at times. So I'm going to go ahead and bring him on and keep on sharing out. We want people to hear this, okay? So here we go.
Now I'm
Hi,
on.
Gary.
Hi, Pookie. How are you doing?
Oh, great. It's such an honor for you to come here and to educate and pour into the people that come here to the Watering Hole to want to know the deeper things of the Lord and where we are in this present date and time, the season and time that we're in.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, it's good to be with you. And just a quick correction. The second book was The New World Religion. That's close.
New World.
It's
See, I got
this
it back.
one right
Thank
here, The
you.
New World Religion.
New
And
World Religion.
my first book was En Route to Global Occupation.
Yes.
It's interesting, the path we walk in life, where to begin. I was born in Dayton, Ohio. I just turned 62. I was born back in 1959, a few years after my parents came over from Europe. My father is the only person I know who first fled from the communists and then the Nazis. And he fled from the communists with his family at age 12, and around age 13, fled from the Nazis and survived. I wouldn't be here had he not been smart and discerning with his family. I mean, they lost everything they had. He grew up in Croatia, and when the communists were closing in on them, they had very little notice, and so they just threw a few pots and pans and a couple suitcases of clothing, formed onto the back of a wagon, and then formed a wagon train with some neighbors and relatives, and said goodbye. Left everything behind: their farms, their homes, everything. And then they just kind of wove in and out of wherever the shooting wasn't taking place. But sometimes they were right in the crossfire too. They had some close calls. And that same year, his father had died. So this happened right after his father died to a 12-year-old. And so he had to grow up really quickly. And long story short, there wasn't really a safe place to go at that time in that part of Europe. But they ended up traveling through part of Hungary and then into Austria, into the mountains. And they were able to find a place there where they thought they'd be safe. But the boarding school that they put him in, where he was supposed to learn a trade, he thought, we're not learning a lot, but we're sure doing a lot of marching and drills. And so one day he was walking down the hallway, and the door to the headmaster's office was open, and he heard him talking to the second in command person. So he paused out there and listened in on their conversation and discovered that they were training all these kids, like 12 to 15, 16-year-olds, to send them on the Eastern Front to fight for Hitler. So he thought to himself, there's no way I've come this far and fled from the communists to now go fight for Hitler. I'm out of here. So that night, he and a friend jumped out of a 2-story window, ran about 20 miles toward where his house was. And he was street smart enough at that time that he figured they'd probably be waiting for him by the time he got home. So he didn't go all the way home. He stayed about a half a mile away, where he had a kind of a good view of the house. And sure enough, the secret police were there. His mom was throwing her hands up in the air. He could tell she was telling them, "I don't know where he is." Anyway, he ended up having to sleep in a barn for at least a couple of weeks until the coast was clear. And then not too long after that, the war ended. After that, because he could speak Croatian, Russian, and German, he was able to get into Germany after the war during the post-war recovery period, because they were short on manpower. And so he and his cousins, their goal was to go into Germany, get work, save up money, and then come to the United States, where they had an uncle who was willing to sponsor them in. So while he was there, he met my mother. And it just so happens she grew up under Hitler with a father who was very outspoken against him, to the point where the secret police came once and looked for him in their little small town of about 300 people. And they think it was the school teacher there, who was a Nazi, who tattled on him because he had been quite outspoken. And fortunately, they went to the mayor's office looking for my grandpa, and the mayor of that little village happened to be a family friend. His daughter and my mother were best friends, so he wasn't about to rat on my grandpa. So he sent them off in the wrong direction and said, "Last time I saw him, he was over in that village." So as soon as they took off in that direction, then he tracked down my grandpa and said, "You've got to get out of here. They're looking for you." And so he ended up sleeping in the forest for a few days, which at the time was pretty dangerous because they had wild boars and some dangerous animals, until the coast was clear. So on both sides, my mom and my dad, they both went through a lot during World War II. Then they came to this country hoping to get away from all of that, because of the great freedoms that we had here. One of my father's uncles sponsored them in. They became citizens, and I was born here in the States. But growing up, I heard about what all they went through, especially during family gatherings. They would talk about all that, and it fascinated me. So I just wanted to give a little bit of background, because in a lot of ways, I wasn't a typical 11 or 12-year-old, because by that age, I was watching the evening news with my dad. I remember watching the Huntley Brinkley report, because international affairs just interested me. And it was around that same time in June of 1970, in between fifth and sixth grade, that I accepted Christ as my Savior. And that definitely added to any level of discernment, And so right away in sixth grade, when we studied world history, I just dove right in, and I just wanted to learn about what happened in World War II and why. How could that have happened in a country where there had been so many Christians? I mean, the Reformation, that's where that took place, and the first Bibles were printed on the Gutenberg press. And then you have all of a sudden, Hitler coming to power and millions of people dying, and so all of that interested me to a very great degree. And I remember making a commitment. I prayed silently in my classroom in Kettering, Ohio, one day. Lord, if anything were to ever happen in this country like what happened in Nazi Germany and Europe during World War II, I promise to you I will take a stand no matter what, no matter the cost. And of course, never thinking that something may actually happen where, the Lord would take me up on that. But I did mean it, and I prayed that. And I believe the Lord hears the prayers of young people when they come from a sincere heart. And so fast forward a few years, when I was 16, I made the mistake of letting a friend drive my car. He had begged me, and finally I gave in. And along the way, we picked up a few other kids from our high school, and so he was driving and talking and not paying attention, crossed over the center line and then overreacted, swerved, and at about 55 miles per hour on a country road, went down a ditch, hit a boulder, and flipped over, and it impacted on my side. And in this case, fortunately, I wasn't wearing a seatbelt. I had just taken it off. Yes. Because we were getting ready to switch and I was going to start driving again. And that's when it happened. But because of that, it threw me out through the window and I cleared the car. Otherwise, I'd have been crushed because of the impact on my side. So when we landed, when everything, when the car stopped moving, I was laying mostly outside the car, but with my body from the knees roughly down still in the car. But I only had scratches and some stitches, and was very fortunate. And but my face was just really torn up. And so on the way to the hospital in the ambulance, I was able to catch a view of myself in the chrome of the ambulance, kind of like a mirror. And I thought, wow, I'm really a mess. And I remember praying. I said, Lord, if you ever allow me to look halfway normal again, I'll do anything for you. And when I got home, some elders from church came, prayed over me, and within 2 weeks, you could barely tell anything had happened. I just healed up in an amazing way. In fact, even the teachers at school said, I've never seen anything like that. The mess that you were, and so that was the Lord, and give the glory to Him. So I guess I look halfway normal because my wife married me. So. So that was the second time now I had made, a commitment. And then went to college, majored in economics and business with the focus on the international side of things, international economics, banking, marketing, and all that. And also I got a German major. So I had 3 majors, graduated, and then not much later, the position opened up in our state government for an international trade specialist. And most states, I assume all states, but at least most states, have individuals who help their local companies export their products to create more jobs back on the home front and to offset the imports coming in. And the person who was in that particular job bailed out at a critical time, right when they were getting ready to take on the biggest project they'd ever done. And I remember going in for the interview. I felt the Lord had opened the door. And it just so happened they needed someone who is fluent in German because of all the business we do here in Indiana with Germany. We live in Indiana now. We moved from Ohio over here, and the state that we're sister states with in Indiana is the same state or province that my mother came from in Germany. So I even spoke their local dialect over there. That was just one of many things that fell into place. And next thing I knew, I had the job, even though I was at a very young age, because they needed somebody. There wasn't anybody else that was, they felt qualified at that time, and they could speak German fluently. And so I started my job, and the first project was the biggest one they'd ever taken on. So, challenges, it can go one way or the other. You can either fail miserably or rise to the occasion with God's help.
Yes.
It can move you ahead in a career, and that's what happened. Everything went off without a hitch. That opened up all kinds of doors. In fact, on my very first trip, I led a trade delegation of about 12 people that included our lieutenant governor and several state officials and people from the private sector to 7 countries, including Israel, Greece, Italy, Spain, Belgium, Germany, just a number of different countries. And it went very, very well. Well, as a result, as I said, that opened up other doors. And my meetings overseas were always organized through the commercial sections of our American embassies. So I was on the payroll of the Indiana state government, but when I traveled overseas, that was all through the federal government. We had a special arrangement on that. And so it didn't take very long. I mean, the first year, I was in situations dealing with people at the embassies and with some of the international business leaders, especially in the energy sector and the medical industry, who I met with. And I was surprised to hear people talking about, a push toward one world. They envisioned an empowered United Nations that would essentially become a world government, and where all the nations of the world would just willingly come under their authority. And as people opened up more with me, as I'd get to know them and ask questions, I got really good at asking dumb sounding questions intentionally, because I found out if you show your hand right away, sometimes people clam up and they won't tell you what they're really thinking. And so I was amazed that, these people were in the State Department at our embassies, but they were globalists. Not all of them. There were some Christians too I met, fortunately.
What
But
year was this again?
this
Gary?
was in the 80s.
Okay.
This was in the 1980s. And so this was when Ronald Reagan was president, but a lot of these people were already in these positions before Reagan came on board. Some of them had already been there at that time for more than 20 years. But when Bush came in later on, let's just say things began moving forward much more quickly. There was a bit of a respite with Reagan in. And so it was fashionable to be conservative, but the liberals in our State Department didn't like that, and they were, many of them were globalists. And later on, I discovered that pretty much has been the case with the State Department since right around World War II and after. And so there's been a strong push toward globalization coming from some of our own government institutions. So, one thing, probably what disturbed me the most was the more I learned from these people and the more they opened up, some of them were involved in what we now refer to as the New Age movement. They had Eastern mysticism was a big part of their religious worldview in some cases. In other cases, they were not very favorable toward Bible-believing Christians or conservative Jews. And so I thought, wow, isn't that interesting? The very things that my parents ran from, these people believe, and they're in our government in pretty key positions, some of them. And it was around that time that I really began to seriously pray, Lord, I'm young, I'm in my 20s, and you put me in this key position. at the time, I remember thinking, I think at my age, I've got the most responsibility of anybody in the state of Indiana at that age. And I felt there's no way that's a coincidence. You know, I was there for a reason. And to find out about all these things, and then to travel to more than 20 countries, some of them 3 or 4 times, for our state government, representing them overseas. It was just, sometimes I had to pinch myself. Is this really happening? And I began asking the Lord, what do you want me to do with this information? You know, do I just continue to gather more? Do I speak up? And if so, where do I begin? And so some time passed. I began doing more and more research. In my book, En Route to Global Occupation, I share some of the different experiences that I had in summary fashion. But over about a 2-year period, I learned about economic developments, political developments, and religious developments, all interwoven, connected, moving us toward a single world government eventually. Yeah. And so that's where my research then began to focus. And so when I began praying about, okay, I've got this information now, I feel like I'm supposed to get it out, but where do I start? You know, do you stand on a street corner and just start talking about the New World Order? People would think you're Looney Tunes. And within a couple of weeks of praying about that, the Lord opened up a door. My best friend at the time was the right-hand assistant to our Indiana Secretary of State. And my friend actually went to Moody Bible Institute, had an interest in Bible prophecy. So we met regularly and kind of exchanged information. You know, what were you learning? And you know, just going back and forth. Right. And he led a Bible study group that included some state legislators, Christian state legislators, and other state officials who met in the Secretary of State's office. And sometimes the Secretary of State himself would join us when he was in town. And anyway, my friend asked me to come and share to that group about some of these things that I had been learning through my travels overseas and also back here on the home front. And so I did. And the people there really were fascinated by it. And I presented some documentation. I wasn't just talking off the top of my head. And that then opened up the door to some other invitations to share at some of their churches and other Bible study groups that they were part of. And that continued for about 10 months. And then one day, on short notice, I was called into the office of one of the directors of our Commerce Department, which international trade was under Commerce, and the lieutenant governor was the director over all of that. So ultimately, he was my boss. But it wasn't the lieutenant governor, as someone else who called me into their office and just began to question me. And they said, "Is it true that you've been speaking out against world government?" I said, "Yeah, that's true." He said, "Don't you think that this move toward world government isn't just a natural evolution of the progress of mankind?" And I said, "No. You know, there's definite planning going into this. And I mean, these people have an agenda and it's quite coordinated." And I began to share some of my research with him. And the Lord must have somehow prepared my heart, because it just started rolling off my tongue. And he let me talk for quite a while. I'd say a good 20 minutes, maybe even longer. And then finally he cut me off. And he said a couple of things. One of the things he said was, as long, I want to get the words right, as long as you work for this administration, you will not talk about any of these things to any groups, regardless of their size, whether they are Christian or non-Christian. Is that understood? Wow. And at that point, I was just silent. I didn't know what to say. And then he said, "You've been a tremendous asset to our administration, and we do not want to lose you, but the choice is yours." And that was the end of the meeting. And I was just kind of blown away by that. And it had nothing to do with my work performance because,
Right.
ironically, prior to that point, during the 2 years or year and a half or so leading up to that, I had gotten 3 special awards and honors, one from the governor, one from the lieutenant governor, and one from the Secretary of State of Indiana for my outstanding work. And so they couldn't just fire me because they'd
Right.
say, why did you give this guy all these awards if he's doing such a lousy job? So I believe it was thought that this would be enough to get me to back down, but so I walked back to my office and stared out the window. I had an incredible office overlooking the State House. I really didn't want to give that up, honestly.
Right, come on.
But I sat there and just stared out the window and thought, what does all this mean? Where do I go from here? And began reflecting on, what my parents went through, the commitment I made as a young kid. Called my friend in the Secretary of State's office, and we had lunch together. I shared with him what had just happened. He couldn't believe it. So I decided I'm not going to jump into anything. I'm just going to give it a little bit of time and pray about what I should do. I already had a pretty good idea of what that would be, but I had already been invited on a trip with our Secretary of State and a few other people to go to Finland, Russia, and China, of all places. And I had accepted that invitation. And so I didn't want to turn that down or back out. And that was like 3 weeks in the future. So I thought I'll go ahead, take that trip yet, and use that also as a time to pray and think, and then make a decision. And so that's what I did. And I'm not going to go into everything I learned on that trip, although that's a whole other story. But I used it as an opportunity to smuggle some Bibles into Russia when you could have gotten into a lot of trouble for doing so. The Lord opened up that door. I thought, if this is going to be my last trip, quite possibly, I want to make it count. So there were some amazing experiences that resulted from all of that. Anyway, when I was on my way back, I was sitting in the airport in San Francisco, and the Lord just gave me the words to write in a letter of resignation. I remember I just started writing, and then I submitted that letter when I got back, giving the administration about 3 weeks notice. And I proceeded to send letters out to my colleagues around the world and people I'd met at the embassies, telling them I was moving on. I didn't tell them all the reasons for leaving, just that I was going to be leaving my job. And 3 days before my last day, I got a call from the lieutenant governor, and we had always gotten along very well. And he called me into his office and he said, "Hey, Gary, as far as I'm concerned, you could talk about anything you want to talk about during your free time. I support freedom of speech." And even before mentioning that, he gave me an opportunity to share about, some of the things that concern me. And so at the last minute, at the 11th hour, I could have stayed on board. But I had already lined things up to leave, and I felt that God was calling me to write a book to document all this. Because I thought, other words, I can talk till I turn blue in the face, but unless I can lay this out and document it in a book form, it's really not going to go anywhere. And so I told him that, and he respected that, and we left on good terms. And so I personally believe the ultimatum came down from higher up. I don't believe it was the lieutenant governor. But anyway, we left on good terms, and I believe this was the little push that I needed to leave my job and begin working on a book. And I thought I could do it in 2 years. My wife was going to keep working as a school teacher, and I was just going to work as fast as I could to get this book done. Well, we began to understand the real meaning of spiritual warfare at that time. Once I committed to this project, it would not be an exaggeration to say all hell broke loose. The devil threw everything he had at us. It was unbelievable. During one 8-month period, my wife was in 3 car accidents. It seems like all I could do was deal with body shops and insurance, companies. A tree fell on our house during an ice storm, knocked out our power. I became very ill and was ill for 2 years. with what now they're calling chronic fatigue syndrome. It's kind of like
Right.
a chronic mononucleosis, really. And I ran a
Yeah.
fever of 99 to 100 for 2 years, which, by the way, was exactly during the time when I was studying Freemasonry. That's a whole other
Oh,
story. I was looking into
yeah.
that because all my research led me to that point. And within a week of beginning to study that is when the sickness started. And within a week or so, when I stopped and I was done with my research, it lifted. But I mean, everything possible was thrown in our path, but God was faithful. Um, Satan threw everything he had at us, but on the other side, God provided supernaturally. We had some amazing things happen. I remember one Friday evening, we were sitting in bed, my wife and I, and she pointed out the fact that a bill was going to be coming up on Monday or Tuesday of that next week for about $200, and we didn't have the money. We had put everything on the line and we're barely scraping by. And she said, "What are we going to do?" And I said, "Well, the Lord knows we're not sluggards. We're working hard. We're doing everything we can. Um, let's pray to Him and ask Him to provide." And so I said a simple, heartfelt prayer, asking the Lord for $200 to get us through. Well, Sunday morning, the church we were going to at the time, Audrey was in the choir, and on Sunday morning, the choir director would open up this cabinet, and inside were slots, and each choir member had the music, in a slot that they pull out. They each had their own slot, and so when Audrey, my wife, pulled her music out from her slot, there was also an envelope in there, and it had our names written on the outside. It said Gary and Audrey. So she opened it up, and inside was a letter, handwritten. It said, "Dear Gary and Audrey, God has blessed me tremendously over the years. I just want to share this small gift with you. Remember, always trust in the Lord, and He will provide." And enclosed were 10 $20 bills, exactly $200. And we hadn't told one person. Nobody knew about it. And there was no signature at the end. To this day, we don't know who it was, but clearly God directed. And we had those kinds of things happen over and over until the project was finally done, which took 6 years. But you talk about a faith builder, when those kinds of things happen, we knew we were on the right track, and that it was just a matter of persevering and trusting the Lord and doing our part to be faithful. And so everything said and done, I ended up with about 800 pages of research and writing, and I had covered all the bases. I felt that I was ready to approach a publisher, but it was way too long. I mean, who's going to read an 800-page book? And it was still somewhat fragmented, but I had the information there. And so I approached a publisher, and within 24 hours, they got back with me and said, "We want to do this," which that too is unheard of for a first-time author. I mean, it was quite amazing. And they also said, yeah, it's got to be trimmed down from 800 pages to about 220 to make it readable. And so those 220 pages ended up being En Route to Global Occupation, this book right here.
And it came, an excellent book. Yeah.
Thank you. Praise God. It came out at the very end of 1991 and into 92. So this year in November, it'll be 30 years. This was 30 years ago.
Wow.
And the amazing thing is, and I give God the glory for this, I certainly cannot take the credit, even if I wanted to. I have not had to retract anything from this book after 30 years. In fact, the things that I wrote about and warned about, they're happening right now. It's just we were about 30 years ahead of our time, and I think that's how the Lord works. He gives people advance warning. Back then, not a lot of people were coming around because people, that's, if it's true at all, it's way out, in the distance. And that's one of the problems. When people could have taken a stand, they didn't. And so now it's upon us. It's happening. And if I have one bone to pick with the American people, it's that usually they don't take a stand and do anything until their backs are to the wall. And that's kind of where we're at now. And so I'm hoping and praying that that enough people will wake up, turn to the Lord, become more discerning, take a stand. And, you know, with Nineveh, I mean, God said in 40 days, I'm going to destroy you. He didn't say, if you repent, I won't. He actually, if you read it, he actually said, I'm going to destroy you in 40 days. And, but then they did repent and God backed down. And so it's not too late until it's too late. But I think we're getting very close to the point where it is going to be too late and these things are going to come in quickly. Now, we know eventually they will happen for sure because it's been prophesied.
Yes.
But I do believe God honors repentant nations and cities, and he has it within his power to hold things back.
Yes.
And so that's where we're at right now. You know, a number of us have been out there for years and years warning people that this time was coming, to repent, to get right with the Lord, to take a stand, to be a shining light where God puts you, the job you're on, the church you're in. And some people did, but not enough. And so right now, the socialist, Marxist, New Agers they're winning the battle. They now control all the major power centers of government and are in this position for about another year and a half until the midterm elections. And that's one reason they're working so feverishly, because they realize they've come a long way pretty quick. And when you look at everything that's happened in the last year and a half, and this is not a trial run. They're in it for the victory. They're going for it at this point. And so we need to understand that. We need to understand the serious nature of it all. And so the rest of the way, we need to be walking very closely with the Lord, be in step with him, be in the Word, seek discernment, and do those things that are truly the most important, that impact eternity with the time that we have left. And that includes anything we're going to do with our families or people we work with, even if they don't want to listen, informing them to the best of our ability in a credible way, and then leaving it in the Lord's hands and see where things go.
Yes. You know, Gary, when I first heard of you was at a conference in 93. I think we figured that was about 1993, End Time Prophetic Conference down in
Modesto.
Modesto. And I was shocked. My daughter and I came down there, and I'd been back, I think the end of 91, about beginning of 92 is when I walked back in a church and was all in. And my daughter and I heard of this conference, and I believe it was through Pat Robertson's show. It was one of the people that was on there, and their church was in Modesto. I can't remember exactly, but we went down, and I was shocked that the auditorium wasn't fuller, because I love end time prophecy. I love the book of Revelations, and I was raised up by a dad that I knew about the Rockefellers. I knew about the Bilderbergers. I knew about Freemasons. I knew about all these things because he made sure I read and studied. And when we came there and you were speaking and the others that were speaking on it, and I got that book, I mean, I bought quite a few copies and handed them out and encouraged other people to hand them out. That was 28 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, you know, of course, we didn't know what would happen once the book came out. And I remember thinking, okay, Lord, I did what you called me to do. You know, I thought I was done or close to done. And almost immediately the talk shows started. And the first year after the book came out, I remember I went back and counted. That's how I know. I did 180 talk shows that first year.
Wow.
And it just again, it was the Lord that opened up those doors, and I became a regular commentator on Beverly LaHaye's program, Beverly LaHaye Live from Washington, D.C., and Marlon Maddox on Point of View, which I think that was the biggest program at the time that dealt with these matters. It went out on like 200 stations at a time. And so the information was blasted out there. And I came to realize the book was really a door opener, because many more people would hear this message than actually read it. But I always wanted people to read it, because that's where the documentation is. And we actually put documents in the book. And I think
Gary,
that's...
Could you hold the book up again so that
Yeah.
they can see?
Yeah, it's called En Route to Global Occupation. And you can go to our website, which is just my name, GaryKah.org, and that's spelled GaryKah.org. And you can get the book there. They're not in bookstores anymore, but you can get them through our organization. And in the back, I was going to reproduce all the documents, and the publisher wouldn't let me. They said they have to do a sampling because of copyright matters, which is crazy, because one of the things I wanted to reproduce back here was a world constitution that had already been written.
Right.
By globalists representing a couple hundred different organizations. They had gotten together and put together a prototype world constitution called the Constitution for the Federation of Earth, believe it or not. And it may still change names. They've been working on it, tweaking it ever since. But I found out about it, and but we put some pages from it, and here's like an example of one letter I got from one of the organizations that I had been invited to join. It's called the World Constitution and Parliament Association, which back in that day was a very prominent group. It was like spokes going out from a wheel. The leaders of over 200 other organizations belonged to this organization, including the former president of the World Council of Churches, former ambassadors and UN officials, mayors of prominent cities. I was probably the youngest person in that organization, but the Lord opened up that door for me to get really an up close and personal look at what they were up to. And amazing that they had already gone so far as to draft a world constitution. And then the other organization that I was invited to join, before I left my job with the government, this was still when I worked for the government, eventually, well, I was in that organization for about 7 years. The last 3 years, I had secret clearance. And that organization today has been brought under the Department of Homeland Security. At the time I was invited to join, Homeland Security hadn't been founded yet. But the organization that I ended up being in eventually was brought under Homeland Security. But like I said, for 3 years, I had secret clearance. And so I did not write about that organization in the book. I thought about it. I was encouraged to do so by the publisher. After much prayer, I decided not to, because I had more than enough information to make my point without going there. But I will just say that this was over 25 years ago. This was during the Bush administration is when I was in that organization when I had the clearance. And this was also when I was working on my book. So this was very interesting, because I was working on a book exposing globalization. I was doing so very quietly. Meanwhile, I was in this organization where I attended meetings in Washington, D.C., where the people who were briefing us, in some cases, were from the Rockefeller Foundation and the Council on Foreign Relations. They were globalists, dedicated globalists, who really had a high degree of respect for the United Nations and its authority. So I thought, okay, wait a second. Now, if a national crisis occurs and martial law is declared and we all get kicked into effect and I have to go serve in one of 3 places that would be top secret until we actually get there, we wouldn't even know where we would be at. We'd have to be away from our families for up to 6 months at a time without being allowed to tell them where we are. And all this being done in the name of national security and restoring our country and for the benefit of the country. But globalists are briefing us who would really be in control if there was a national crisis under martial law. Would it be someone who really loved our country and was patriotic and was trying to preserve our Constitution and uphold our freedoms? Or would it be a bunch of globalists who could turn us over to the UN on a silver platter under such circumstances? So I was very concerned about that. And it was actually my experiences in that organization that gave me the greatest part of my perspective for writing my book. Because people have asked me before, how did you know? How did you know this or this would happen or things would move in this direction? And it was a lot of the insights I gained in that organization that kind of helped me to see ahead some. And the Lord used that. Even I've got to tell you this story quickly. I'm just sharing some personal things today, just being transparent. I had cousins who came over to visit from Germany, my first cousin and her husband, actually. And we got to talking about global government. And this was when I was writing my book. And they asked me some questions, and I gave them the answers as best as I could based upon the research I had done at the time. And my cousin's husband said, how will there ever be a world government when there are even two Germanys? The two Germanys can't even get along. So how's there going to be a world government?
Right.
And I said, yeah, I get that. There are two Germanys, but I believe because of that soon there won't be. I believe that the Berlin Wall is going to come down and there's going to be one Germany. And he began to laugh. In fact, he laughed so hard that even I had to laugh because it was contagious. He was sitting at our kitchen table, slapping his knee, leaning back in his chair, saying, finally, when he could compose himself, he said, "You're an American and I'm a German, and you're telling me that Germany is going to be reunited in the near future." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "No way." He said, "Not during my lifetime. Maybe 100 years from now, but not during my lifetime. It's never going to happen." And he just kind of said it in a kind of a cocky way. And I said, "Well, whatever." That was in July of 1989. In November of 89, the Berlin Wall came down. Now, how did I know that? Well, at the meeting that I attended with this organization I just was alluding to in Washington, D.C., for one of our luncheons, we were bused to the local naval base. It wasn't far away from the Capitol building. You could see the dome in the distance. It's maybe 3 or 4 miles from there, if that. But they told us there'd be a very important speaker for lunch. His name was Leo Chern, Chern, and there might have been an E at the end of his name. I can't remember. I'd never heard of him before, but he was said to be close friends with Henry Kissinger and certain other people who I did recognize their names as being globalists. And when the luncheon was ready to start, when they introduced him as a speaker, it seemed like forever, because they listed all the awards he had received from the United Nations. And his claim to fame was that he had worked in every administration, Democrat or Republican, since World War II. And so he was one of these permanent fixtures in Washington. And people wonder why nothing seems to change. Republicans come in, Democrats come in, and things just keep moving along. And what people don't understand is there is an establishment in place, thousands of workers, most of them with a socialistic, globalist bent, who have permeated our CIA, our FBI, our State Department, most of our judicial system. They're entrenched, and until they die, they're in. In fact, you could argue some of these people have more power than presidents because of the continuity. They just stayed there and keep going. And so he was one of those people. And And during his talk, he said a number of, to me, outrageous statements. By the way, before that luncheon, we were told not to take notes. They said they would make a transcript available at some point in the future, which I thought was interesting.
Mm.
And so anyway, he's among the things he said was that we needed to move away in this country from our Judeo-Christian ethic and embrace the religious philosophies of the East. And then he gave a couple of examples, like Japan and a couple of other countries, that we needed to take on their religious views, and in order to be able to come into the new order and be a voice in the new direction of the world. And by that time, I already knew quite a bit about the New Age movement. I had studied it, and I mean, it's basically Eastern mysticism, right?
Yeah.
So I thought, that's interesting. This guy's talking about politics, economics, and religion, not being politically correct as far as Christians are concerned. He's just coming out there saying things, not having any fear of any ramifications of what he's saying, which told me he feels comfortable speaking to this audience because he believes they're all pretty much on the same page with him. There are just a couple of us out there. I identified one other Christian, maybe one other I'm not sure about. And beyond that, as far as I could tell, they were globalists who'd been recruited by this organization. I think they thought I was a globalist because of the position I had held in the government. They just assumed if you're the Europe and Middle East trade specialist, that you would be an internationalist, so to speak, or a globalist. And so here I was sitting there listening to all this. But the thing that stuck in my mind the most was when he talked about the Berlin Wall. And he practically came out and said, it's going to come down. I can't remember his exact words, but I came away clearly with the impression, okay, this guy either knows something and he's very powerful, or he's crazy, And I remember coming home and telling my wife that. I said, these people are either incredibly powerful or they're nuts. We'll soon find out. But I believe that he knew something that was going to be happening soon. And so it was just a month or two after that my cousin was over here and that I shared with them what I thought. And then a few months later, it happened. And so there are very powerful players behind the scenes that, to the best of their ability, that their power will allow them, are trying to direct the affairs of mankind, pushing us toward world government. And what had to happen, Pookie, is that the way the world order was prior to 1990, the late 80s, around 1990, if you think about it, the American people it would have been a very difficult sell to try to convince them to merge with communist Russia and communist China and other communist countries into a one world government. But if somehow people can come to believe that really these countries have moved toward democracy and have opened up, and of course what they wouldn't tell you is we have to move towards socialism and kind of meet them somewhere in the middle, then there could be a world government. So what all of this was about, the Iron Curtain coming down, was simply restructuring the appearance of these communist nations to make it palatable for the Western nations to be willing to come together with them into a world government. And really, I believe that was the goal of the United Nations all along. If you read the charter of the UN, I think people would be surprised. They talk about regionalism, clustering countries together as regional groups, economic groups first, and then it's easier to turn them into political groups. We've seen this happen in Europe. And once you're to that point, it's just one step further to take them into a global system. And they've tried to do the same thing with NAFTA here in the United States. Trump threw a wrench into that, but everything that he did to pull us out of that, they're trying to undo right now. And so their main obstacle has been the United States and Christians in other countries too that have been taking a stand, trying to stem the tide. But still, things are moving in the other direction. Right now, they have more momentum than they've ever had.
Yes.
Had it not been for the fact that people have taken a stand over the years, a growing number, it may have already happened. And so I do believe the Lord has been very generous to even give us this much time. But now, it's crunch time. I mean,
Yes.
unless the Lord intervenes, I think within the next 2 years, it could be all over. We could be in a one world government, be experiencing full blown persecution of Christians and conservative Jews. They have to erase the Judeo-Christian ethic. That's really what our country's foundations were built upon largely. In the 1800s, when people from France came over here, and France already at that time was largely an atheistic country, they would go back to France and say the real power, the real secret of the United States is in the churches. These people are a religious, moral people. Not that we were a perfect nation by any stretch, but a nation that, when it realizes it's doing something wrong, tries to correct those wrongs and do what is right. The Bible was the main textbook in schools back then.
Yes.
That's how people learned to read.
Yeah.
And you look at where we're at today, and it's a shame, but it didn't happen overnight. The National Education Association and all the funding from the Rockefeller and Carnegie groups of foundations that helped launch the General Education Board with John Dewey, which ultimately led to the NEA. And my wife was a public school teacher for 11 years, and she'd come home and tell me some of the stuff being taught. It was just, it would blow your mind. And that was back in the 80s and 90s. So we have a whole generation now that's been indoctrinated. It's come through the schools, the universities, the media, Hollywood, even the medical establishment to a large degree. I saw a survey not long ago, and it polled doctors, how medical doctors vote. And as I recall, it was something like, I can't recall for sure, but I'm thinking it was 78% of them, right at 80%, voted very liberal Democrat. And, and that's interesting because they're doctors. They're also private entrepreneurs to a degree, but because the more you're in the education system, studies will show this, the longer you're in, the more liberal you become. And so back when I saw this survey, it was a few years back, high school students were more conservative than college students, and college students with an undergraduate degree were more conservative than college students with a master's or doctorate degree. And so the longer you're in the throes of the education system, the more liberal you become, the more indoctrinated you become. It's true. That's not to say you're not going to learn any truth at all while you're there, but Satan is a deceiver. He throws a lot of his muck in there with it, and you come out believing all those things. And so today we have the World Health Organization that is absolutely a Marxist organization through and through. Tedros Ghebreyesus, who is the head of the World Health Organization, is a former Ethiopian revolutionary leader. And how was he rewarded? He was made the director of the World Health Organization. He's been tight with China for years and years. And also the man who's second in command at the World Health Organization, same thing. So the top two players in that organization they're basically communists. And then you have the UN Secretary General himself, Guterres. He was the head of an organization called the Socialist International, which is the motherlode of all the socialist one world organizations in the world. They all feed into it. He was the head of that while also being president of the country of Portugal for a time. And what is his reward? He's made UN Secretary General. He's essentially a socialist communist as well. Most people have no clue because they don't do the research. This is not a secret at all. No,
it's not.
The information is out there, and I'm telling you the truth on this. And so why are we so quick to fall in line with everything the UN wants rather than pushing back? And why is the UN on American soil to begin with? you know.
Exactly.
Um, After World War One, Woodrow Wilson tried to establish the League of Nations, which was to be the first step in the direction of ultimately a global government. But much to his embarrassment, the American people smelled a rat. They wanted nothing to do with an international organization like that, headquartered in Geneva. And so they put pressure on Congress to keep us out, and it worked. And so even though Woodrow Wilson was at the forefront, his own country ended up not joining in. Well, you cannot have a world government without the US, the most powerful country in the world, being in the mix. So to make sure that wouldn't happen again the second time around, after World War II, it was decided to form a new organization, the United Nations, and this time to put it on American soil. It would help, in their view, cause the American people to think that we're more in control of this because it's in our country. What most people did not realize is that the land upon which the United Nations was built in New York City was donated by the Rockefeller family. They ended up making a ton of money off of it, by the way, because all the land around there, which was largely swampland, went sky high in value once the UN was there, and they were able to sell off a lot and make a ton of money off of it. But anyway, the Rockefellers and their allies also, of course, helped to fund the Council on Foreign Relations, which was started in the early 1920s. And at the founding meeting of the UN, which was held in San Francisco before the United Nations building was actually built and it was moved to New York. But at that meeting in San Francisco, there were dozens of Council on Foreign Relations members there. It's basically a CFR event. Mm-hmm. So if the Council on Foreign Relations was so involved in the founding of the United Nations, then that should that should cause us to ask the question, what is the CFR all about, right? Right. And you look into the key players that started that, they were staunch one world socialist types of people that played both the Democrats and Republicans. It didn't care to them. They wanted people in both parties, which was very smart on their part. So you had four Rockefeller brothers, right? One of them was a Democratic governor. I think they were Democrats in West Virginia and Arkansas, if I remember correctly, at least in one of those states. And of course, Nelson Rockefeller was a Republican governor of New York. There wasn't a dime's worth of difference of what they believed, but it's whatever it takes, to be elected and to do what they want to get done. And so by World War II, they had already made some inroads. But from World War II forward, the State Department just was completely penetrated. And FDR, who was a 33rd degree Freemason and a globalist, initiated a council. It's called the Post-War Foreign Policy Committee. I actually document all of this in my book, En Route to Global Occupation. As I remember, there were 14 people in that committee, 10 of whom were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. And this was the planning committee that conceived the idea for the United Nations and put all of that in motion. So it came right down, through FDR, who was also in those circles, and the Council on Foreign Relations, funded by these large major foundations, and so that's where the UN came from. So the UN also has a very strong spiritual history, not spiritual as in Christian, but in occultic. And one of the early Secretary Generals of the UN was U Thant. He was actually a practicing Buddhist monk while he was UN Secretary General. Most people weren't aware of that fact. Another individual who played a very instrumental role at the UN was Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, a French Jesuit priest. And he basically became like a prophet to the UN. A lot of people viewed him as such. He mentored a lot of the top UN leaders. And even though he claimed to be a Catholic, he was heavily into the Eastern religions and thought, and he melded Christian terminology with occultic ideas and came up with all kinds of new terms like the noosphere. What in the world is the noosphere? It's the idea that every time you think a thought or dream a dream, it goes into this global mind, and anybody else, if they go into an altered state of consciousness, can tap into that and withdraw that thought. So it's like everything in the world, it's pantheism is what it is. It's what is at the core of Hinduism, right? That God is a force, and that all living things, plants, animals, and human beings are all part of this God force. Therefore, if you take the sum total of all living matter, you have God. That's what God is. God is no longer a personal God creator. Rather, he is this force, and we can all tap into it and become part of it. And that, of course, lies at the core of the New Age movement. And so the UN from the very beginning was coming from that standpoint. But if they would have been open about that, people would have rejected that, especially in the 40s and 50s, where you were still dealing with a significant percentage of the American population who were Christians. Even nominal Christians at the time would have seen through that. And so they worked largely behind the scenes, started the World Council of Churches, which also got started with the help of the Rockefeller Foundation, a generous donation from them. And then in the 60s, things really cranked up. And in the 80s, there's a bit of a reprieve. And then in the 90s, it just really began moving forward. And then with President Bush Jr., the second Bush, the last 2 years of his administration, it's almost as if he threw in the towel and things began to happen and really move forward quickly. He came under a lot of heat, and it's just like he gave up. I think he was kind of in between. His father was a globalist, no question about it, but he also had some conservative Christian influences in his life that were, I believe, real. And so I think he struggled, he wrestled with that some. But the last 2 years, things began happening. Then with Obama, things began to come in like a flood. And I think it rekindled racism, because suddenly everything began to be about race. And whenever you point out differences between races, rather than saying we are all people of equal value before God, it highlights race. It doesn't let people forget about races. The idea that we're all one people. Yeah, I mean, we all have souls. We're of equal value before God, our Creator. Rather, it makes us appear to be different from each other. And if there are differences, then are some races smarter than others? Are some more advanced than others? Are some more entitled than others? Hitler was a huge racist. And he was able to use evolution to argue that. And he argued that Black people simply aren't as highly evolved as whites. That's something else. All these intellectuals who believe in evolution, they're helping to foster racism through that belief system. They are. You look at all the most racist societies in the world, and evolution had become a big part of that. And so, I could go on and on about what's wrong with our education system today and how we've been set up, how our young people have been indoctrinated, and how racism now is, again, a major issue, when really, I honestly, we know thousands of people over the last 30 years. I figure conservatively, maybe 5,000 to 7,000 people that one-on-one, we know who they are. We've had deep discussions with each other, so on and so forth. And I can tell you fewer than 10 of them, unless they put on an incredibly good act, are racist. And so this media narrative, that started, that makes, all whites appear as racist, is simply not true. But it's almost like they're trying to make that true, so that they have a narrative to divide our country, because they have to weaken us. And if they can divide us,
Yes.
they can divide and conquer and bring in their socialism. And it's no coincidence that 2 of the 3 founders of Black Lives Matter openly stated that they are Marxists, that they are trained Marxists. But you won't hear that from CNN or MSNBC. They won't tell you that. But these are in their own statements. And so we're being taken for a ride. And especially the individuals 35, 40 years old and under have really fallen for all of this, because they're watching and listening to the media and their college professors who, can I say this as a Christian? They're either incredibly stupid or just outright evil. I'm talking about these college professors and the media people who are perpetrating this huge deception upon the American people. They're one or the other. They're either incredibly naive and stupid, or they're just flat out evil. And I think there's some of each, really, in all of that. And so, and as Christians, though, we have to be careful. We cannot lose our hearts of compassion for those people, because they're the most messed up of all, who we need to reach with the truth of the gospel. Most of them probably won't listen or receive it, but a percentage of them will. And if not, at least they've been told, and they will be held accountable. And that's how we have to look at it. But God doesn't always send us to the people who are an easy sell. People who are already in the camp, anybody can do that. But look at what the Lord did with the prophets in the Old Testament. He had them prophesying to those people who least wanted to hear the message. And some of them were stoned to death because of that. And Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh because of what might happen. And he also, though, feared the Lord's mercy, because he wanted to see Nineveh destroyed. He had hardened his heart against Nineveh. Didn't want to go there because he thought maybe, just maybe, if he preaches the word there, the people would end up repenting, and then God would spare them, and he wanted to see them destroyed. And I have to admit, I deal with that mindset sometimes. I get so upset sometimes when I see the misinformation in the news, and so much of it coming from the major hubs like New York City, which has become a cesspool of misinformation. That part of me wants to say, Lord, why don't you just destroy? Why don't you just wipe these evil people out, because they're speaking lies, and leading your people astray? And then I think, but no. These are the very people that need to be reached, because once they're gone, if they die, they're going to spend eternity in hell. And as Christians, we should not wish that upon our worst enemies, because eternity is a long, long time, and hell is very real, and it's a horrible place, and there's no escaping it once you're there. And so that's a challenge to us as Christians all the time, even to pray for those who persecute us and despise us, because they're in the worst shape of anybody. If God allows, they might be able to persecute us and put us to death in this life, but then we're with the Lord for eternity. But on the other hand, what will their reward be, or their consequences for doing what they've done? They'll be spending eternity in hell. And so that's a very sobering thought, and we need to remind ourselves of that.
Yeah, it's a spirit and not the person.
That's right. And Ephesians 6, 10 through 13, telling us that we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. And these are demonic forces that these people oftentimes unwittingly began opening themselves up to. And then once you give Satan an inch, he takes a mile and just runs with it and keeps going. And pretty soon, some of these people, it's amazing in politics what I learned, how many of these people go to seances, have spiritual guidance people who are psychics. Here in Indiana, it was huge. I became aware of a former governor and mayor. Everybody would know their names if I'd mentioned them, who is going to the local sorceress participating in that, wanting to know what to do. It blew me away. I had no idea. It totally
And
changed my
this,
view of government. This
and
was in
this
the
is
80s.
yeah, this is pretty much all over the world, correct? It's not just in the US.
Yeah, I mean, I did meet all the leaders of the world, obviously, but I met
Right,
some powerful, influential people overseas. And at the very least, many of them were into Eastern philosophy. They like to use that term.
right,
Some people have deluded themselves into thinking they can actually be practicing Buddhists and still be Christians because they've come to classify Buddhism as a philosophy and not a religion, which is another deception of the
right,
enemy. Um,
right.
so many of these intellects, they think they're too smart to be deceived, and that pride is their biggest fall, and that was what brought Lucifer down. Pride, ultimately. He thought he knew better than God, and rebelled, and I wrote about some of this recently in my most recent article. We publish a quarterly, 20-page quarterly, and this is how we keep people up to date, because I can't communicate with people directly anymore, one-on-one. In most instances, it's just impossible. Last time I checked my phone, I had 23,000 emails. I mean, it's
Well,
just,
thank you for
and
getting back
and
to me.
well, no, I don't mean to sound like that, but I'm just saying, and some of that is junk mail, obviously,
Yeah.
but still, it's just become impossible. And so,
Mhm.
to stay in touch with people, we put this out. We monitor the questions that people are asking, and then very prayerfully, I tried to allow the Lord to lead me to write on the things that are most important at the time. And this most recent issue that just came out a couple weeks ago, I wrote it in June, is called UFOs, Extraterrestrials, and Fallen Angels. And it's so important, I felt I went ahead and posted it on our website. So you can actually read this if you log on at garycod.org. On our homepage, go down toward the bottom, and you'll see the recent articles. And again, it's under UFOs, Extraterrestrials, and Fallen Angels. And we have seen a huge increase in UFO phenomena over the last year. Suddenly, it's front and center. It's
Yes.
in the news reports. It's everywhere. And if people are wondering what that is all about, that also ties into this global agenda. And I don't have time to go into all of it now. We're starting to run short on time.
Yeah.
But do take the time to read that article. I think people will find that very helpful. I quote a ton of scripture in there. I go back to the Bible, and I believe that quite probably the biggest deception of all, spoken of in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, the powerful delusion. I thought to myself, and I've been asking the Lord, what could be such a huge delusion that people would fall for this because they just feel like, yeah, I mean, who can argue with this?
Right.
Well, what if you have extraterrestrials who, in my belief, are actually fallen angels or demonic hybrids,
Mhm.
appear on the scene, and what kind of reaction would that create? What would it do to people's psyche if these beings really exist, and if they fall for the idea that they're simply extraterrestrials who are more highly evolved than we are from other planets and other worlds, which you're going to be inclined to believe if you believe in macroevolution, because if we evolved
Right.
here, then who's to say that other life forms didn't evolve somewhere else, that they are more highly evolved than we are, and therefore they have technologies and ways of communicating that we cannot yet fully understand. Therefore, we'd better listen to them because they're smarter than we are.
Right.
Also, it's interesting that in Revelation, that the Antichrist is referred to as the beast. And I don't want to jump to conclusions there, because he's also referred to as a man of lawlessness, but in the
Right.
King James Version referred to as that wicked in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. But anyway, the rise of the Antichrist, at the very least, is in association with this powerful delusion spoken of in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And I believe somehow this is going to be tied in with a manifestation of these beings, these demonic creatures.
Right.
And the fact that this is now in the news almost every day for the last few months, and this is heating up, and you have programs like Skinwalker Ranch, the secrets of Skinwalker Ranch, which I talk about quite a bit in my article, which involved Harry Reid from Nevada, who traveled there and actually was wondering about all the mysterious things that are happening in that spot, which is in Utah. And that led to congressional investigations and some of this information now becoming public knowledge. And they're going to be hitting on this more and more. And so this deception will be multifaceted. It's going to come, the vaccine. They've got to convince us all to take the mRNA vaccine, because that's going to be a building block. That's why they want to get it into all of us. It's going to be a platform.
It's not an actual vaccine.
Correct. It's basically gene therapy. It's a whole new technology that's unproven, but they're pushing that. They're pushing globalization and the move towards socialism. They're doing everything they can to bring it about, to collapse our economy. If everything's going well, there's no reason for people to change and embrace something new. So everything about the old order, including our health institutions and how they function, our economy, if things are going well, why would people join into a one world economic system and at some point be willing to receive a mark that you're going to need to be able to buy or sell that may well be associated with a type of vaccine? They'll probably bring it in on the backs of a health mandate. That makes the most sense to me. If you put yourself in their shoes, if they tell people, if you don't take this, you're going to be a health risk to everybody else, and therefore you need to take it. Hitler actually did that with the Jews in Austria.
Yes, he did.
A lot of people aren't aware of that. The Austrian people, who were not a majority anti-Semitic people in the beginning, he led them through his propaganda machine to believe that the Jews had been infected with a deadly disease, and that if you are around them, you will catch it, you will die as well. Therefore, they needed to be isolated and moved away. That's how it started. And then we all know how it ended up. And so I see history repeats itself. It's just, there's a higher degree of technology now and propaganda. Things are moving more quickly because of the news cycle and social media. But all of this is part of this growing deception. And then I think, to top it all off, it's just my opinion, but I think a lot of things point to it. I think there's going to be some type of extraterrestrial deception. I don't believe it's going to happen until God allows it. He is still sovereign. But when things get to the point in the world where sin has reached its full measure, and he says no more, I think he's going to allow things to run their course, and these things will be fulfilled. We're getting very, very close, I believe, to that time. So I'm looking at my watch. We're down to a few minutes. I just feel led to say, if I had to tell people anything at this point, I would say walk closely with the Lord. Draw near to him. Be in his word. Talk to him daily, and just walk with the Lord. A lot of people have a head knowledge of Jesus. They believe he died for their sins, but have really neglected developing a relationship with him, a walk with the Lord. And to deal with the times we're coming into and everything that's going to be thrown at us, we're going to have to hear the voice of the Lord. I mean, we're going to have to be so close to the Lord that he's able to direct us very clearly and very quickly in this direction or that direction. Some of us some of us are going to be where we're at, proclaiming the truth to the end, and are going to be persecuted because of it. But others, God may want to move us here or there to keep us out of harm's way so that we can
Right.
keep declaring his truth.
Right.
And unless we are very tight with the Lord, he's not going to be able to work through us the way he wants to. He wants us to be warriors for him,
Yes.
presenters of the truth
Yeah.
in these last days. And we are nothing without the Lord, and we're nothing. I've got so many shortcomings. Some of them are actually kind of funny and laughable. You could talk to my wife, and she could tell you about a lot of them. But God uses vessels who are committed to him and are willing to be used. And so if we humble
Yes.
ourselves before the Lord, that's the first requirement, and that we live repentant lives. And if we slip up, that we repent and keep moving forward with the Lord. And ultimately that comes down to faith, having faith in the Lord, that he loves us, that he forgives us, that he's patient with us.
Yes.
And as long as we don't abuse his grace, which some people do, they pray a prayer of profession of faith when they're 5 years old and then live like the devil the rest of their lives, and think they're saved. I mean,
Yeah.
that has to stop.
Yeah. Once saved, always saved. That's the other part of all the
Well,
universalism in that. Once saved, always
well,
saved.
there are people who I think that they're saved who never were to begin with. They never turned
Right.
their lives over to the Lord.
Right.
I'll never forget somebody telling me the story about a mafia figure, mid-level mafia figure in New York City, attended a crusade and went forward, accepted Christ, and then kept living the way he had been and doing the same thing. And somebody approaching him saying, "Hey, I thought you became a Christian." He said, "Yeah, I did." And they said, "Well, you can't live like this and keep doing this." And it was like, "Why not?" And so the whole repentance aspect is left out of the gospel message these days so much of the time. And people just narrow it down to just praying a simple prayer. And people do that and they believe they're saved, but they've never turned their lives over to the Lord. They've never repented of their sins. And that doesn't mean you're going to be perfect the rest of your life, but it means you live in a spirit of repentance. If you do slip and fall, you confess it to the Lord and repent and change and turn.
Yes.
And
Change.
and so that's a big part of the problem, is so much of Christianity has been watered down and become a social club, and people aren't living repentant lives before the Lord. The idea of holiness, people say, well, Christ is our holiness, and he is. I mean, he died on the cross to pay the penalty for our sins, but we are to strive to be as much like Jesus as we can be. He set the example. He's our example. And be therefore holy as I am holy. I mean, he set the standard, and so again, that's a sobering message and thought, but we all can do better and draw closer to the Lord. And I believe that's why he's allowing us to see the signs of the times.
Yes.
He's given us his prophecies so that we can be ready as things begin to happen and that we are not caught off guard. So I close with that.
Yes. Amen. Well, thank you so much for coming. Will you come back?
I will. I will say this. The Lord has put something on my heart, and I would ask for listeners to be praying for me. I'm going to be on a writing deadline for the next 2 months, roughly.
Okay.
And so people won't be hearing much from me during that time. But this is something I've been trying to do for a while, and I've been trying to clear out my schedule so that I can take it on, because we have so much going on, and we have an almost 90-year-old father who has a lot of health conditions. We've had over 120 doctor's appointments with him in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
And so, there are a lot of distractions that things that we have to deal with, but that are important nonetheless.
Right.
And so I would just pray that God would give me a few good weeks to be able to put some things in writing that I need
Yes,
to speak and get out there. And I'll let you
absolutely.
know when I've accomplished that with God's help. So
All right. All right.
it's
Well,
good to be
thank you
with
so
you,
much.
Pookie. Thank you so much
Oh,
for this
it's such an
opportunity.
honor, and thank you for just sharing your heart and equipping them further, the people further, to know what to be looking at should the Lord, not tarry. There's always the God factor.
Right,
That's the main thing, the God
right.
factor, but we have to do our part to be prepared and ready.
That's
So I
right.
so appreciate you, and it was an honor having you on, and I look forward to you coming back.
Okay.
And you have a blessed day, and I'll
Thank
see
you.
you in the back. I'll just wave out, and we'll go in the
Okay.
back, and then okay,
Okay. All righty.
okay,
Bye-bye. God
bye
bless you.
bye. Uh-huh.